Bitcoin is going to be the greatest enabler of renewable energy. Until we have like a perfect form of storage for energy capacity, which has been a very challenging problem that's stagnated for decades, then the ideal buyer is a buyer of energy who's on demand and on site. And Bitcoin miners are the only people in the world who are that type of a buyer.
The tree is branching out, right, as a result of Bitcoin economically. The practical and the moral are in strong alignment.
I think I had a pretty nihilistic perspective on human nature as well. People's morality is subject to circumstance. Ultimately, it comes down to fulfillment of needs and wealth. Are you familiar with David Foster Wallace's commencement address, "This is water"? If you worship something that is of this world, it's eventually just going to eat you alive. Everybody worships something. The question is what? The culty aspects of what's happening in Bitcoin. The more I get involved in it, I'm like, oh no, this is what makes it cool.
They've got a lot of disagreeable people to agree.
What a lot of competing banks would do against each other, they would hold on a concentrated set of notes from one of their competitors for a period of time, and they'd take them and go redeem them all at once. They try to run bank runs on each other effectively.
It's a shot across the bow. The 10 years that a seed of a tree spins in the dark. Bitcoin spent a lot of time in the dark. No one cares about it. That is one of the most important elements of Bitcoin's success, is that it was born into a world where no one gave a shit about it for 10 years. So, after a thorough prep, let's talk. So, I typically don't know backgrounds, but I think yours is super relevant in this case, just about where you come from and the perspectives you have on Bitcoin and its implications. So, could we just start with your professional background?
Yeah, professional background. I mean, the big thing was that I was lucky enough to have been introduced to free market economic thinking early on in my life. And it was that was one of the first things that kind of like intellectually captivated me when I was younger. I was a terrible student in high school. Like I hated school. It was just boring to me. And it wasn't until I discovered economics that I was actually interested in something, because it seems so relevant as to how you make decisions about the world. Yeah. And I studied finance in school and, set these lofty goals. I wanted to work for a big fancy private equity firm and, do all these things. And I think that a lot of my reasoning around that was, it was predicated upon my, ultimately like philosophical perspective on where the world's going. And that's what economics is. And, and I had a very nihilistic opinion of what that was. And it was, central banking was a problem, and it's just the way that the world works. And this is a result of power, and the, quote unquote democratic system that we have today is, the best protection we've had against that so far. Central banking still has overcome it over time. And nonetheless, but this is just the way the world works. And, I was working in distressed private equity where we would buy out businesses that were in challenging situations, close to bankruptcy. We specialized in acquiring corporate carve-outs of larger enterprises. So like if a big company wants to get rid of this like poor performing division, nobody wants to buy that. We specialize in finding ways to buy it and make a lot of money off of it. And it's a really profitable area to get into. And it's particularly profitable in a world where we're filled with zombie companies and all of this underperformance and a lot of cyclical crashes that are occurring and prevalent credit, because using debt for this type of a business is really beneficial. So like that's benefited the private equity industry significantly. Yeah. And if that were to change to like whatever the market rate is tomorrow, who knows what would happen to private equity. But, and I think that, so, that was kind of how I was viewing the world. And I remember I was never a technologist. And the first few times I heard about Bitcoin, I was like, oh, it's a speculative investment. Doesn't have any fundamental value. I have my CFA. I applied that framework of thinking of securities analysis to Bitcoin. And it wasn't until like a good buddy of mine who was just like, dude, you need to look more into this. And I was just like, God, I trust a lot. I'm like, all right, I'll spend some more time. And then I encountered some sort of, it was like a Reddit post or something saying like Bitcoin's an alternative to central banking. Yeah. And that was like the very first light bulb that clicked in my head about it. And I was like, okay, this is really, really interesting. And I spent a lot more time, reading into it after that.
So similar to my path. I'm fascinated.
Yeah. And it was, I think that it was that framing that changed everything. Cause up until that point, it was just like, it's blockchain technology is how people sell it to me. And I'm like, cool, how do we value the technology? Maybe it's worth a lot, but it's not the type of investing I do when I can't have a framework of value for it. And then when you think it's an alternative to central banking, it's just like, whoa, like, okay, so this is basically solving every problem that I've, resonates with me more than anything else. Out of all the problems in the world I'm aware of, this is what I'm most aware of.
Yeah.
And I think that got me really, really interested in it. And then that started the whole path of, me entering the industry and writing my book and everything else from there.
Amazing. Yeah. I share the nihilistic perspective I had prior to discovering Bitcoin. For me, it was Creature from Jekyll Island in 2004 or 5. That was my, I guess, black pill on central banking, if that's the right term. I just realized it's the problem, but there's no solution.
Yeah.
And then, 2018 Bitcoin Standard finally connected the dots that this was the answer to that. So I can share in that experience of the journey.
Yep.
So you wrote the book. You said 7's your lucky number. So 7 properties. Can we let's just walk through them. Like maybe just to like introduce a general framework for Bitcoin.
Yeah,
and then I want to get into more, we were connecting in the pre-talk here on evolution and some other things, but just to like frame up Bitcoin in your book. Let's start there.
I think that, and I think you're saying that we could put up the chart for my properties or whatever.
Yes,
and I can just walk through all that.
Yeah. Actually, let me do it on here.
We don't have to put it up here. I got it in my memory.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, we just talk through it.
Yeah, but we can put it up on the video.
Put it up here.
Yes,
So assuming that like this chart is up, it's basically like, so what the first thing that I wanted to tackle in the book was with a lot of the literature, there was different framings for monetary value. And, you had Safe Dean talking about salability across time, space, and scales, the standard framework of store value, medium of exchange, unit of account, and then people talking about monetary properties. And there was a lot of different, I would see a lot of people like mixing them up a lot and things like that. And I was like, let's get this all on one page and let's show exactly like how all of this relates to each other. And so I put together this chart, and at the top, it's like you have the definition of, money, Carl Menger, 19th century, the most saleable good. And like you define that as the good with the lowest rate of declining marginal utility.
Right.
And that's just, it's funny because it's kind of a backward looking way of defining money. And that's like the broadest. It's kind of how you have to look at it. It's very backward because, why does it have the lowest rate of declining marginal utility? And what does that mean for like people listening? It's just, certain goods have more or less the rate at which the utility you gain for it as you consume it declines. So if you have one piece of pizza, the first one is going to be much higher utility than the 5th or the 7th when it hurts to eat.
Yes.
And in a house, the first one, that initial shelter is much more significant than, the 3rd or 4th, which is a, excellent convenience to have in life, but not putting a roof over your head. You already have that.
Yeah.
And so money is something where the rate at which you lose utility from consuming it declines the least. So it's like money can't necessarily make you happy, but it can benefit you the most, the longest. That's for sure.
It's because of its universality. Right?
Yeah, it's universal. You can trade it for everything else. And that's the reason that the more you get of it, it's a thing that you can't get enough of effectively. Yeah. And so, that was kind of the overarching definition. And then in like the Bitcoin Standard, what was really interesting is how Safe Dean was like, okay, we can think about that concept of salability across 3 different dimensions about time, space, and scales. And scales was the most interesting thing to me because it was always clear in my head about time and space. Money helps us, move value throughout time very easily. It helps us move it across space very easily. But I never really thought about moving it across scales being a really good unit of account. Ultimately is what that means. And being able to easily group and divide something. That's effectively what that's doing. That's a great way of framing it. So that's what the functions of money really are. It's like within this dimension, something that moves value across time well is a good store of value. Something that moves value across space very well is a good medium of exchange, and something that moves it across scales is a good unit of account. So like in this table, I have it set up to say like, here's how that's all linked under, being the most saleable good. And then the final piece is, okay, well, we've defined these functions. We defined the dimensions in which they exist. but what fundamentally can allow us to assess it. And that's the monetary properties that something has. We can look at any good and we can say it has these particular properties. Of course, it's not like some perfect scientific way of measuring it. We can't, bust out the meter and, test it in the lab, but we can look at qualitative assessments of things and we can observe it empirically that some things have properties that are better than others. One thing that is pretty easy to measure over time is scarcity. So I have on under, something being a good store value, it's like, what are the two properties best associated with that function? It's like something that's very scarce and something that's very durable. Scarce and it's durable. It's going to move value throughout time pretty well. And with the function of medium exchange, it's like something that's very widely accepted and something that's very portable.
And divisible, right?
Yeah. And divisible is what I put under unit of account.
It kind of crosses the boundaries of the two.
Right. Yeah. And of course, none of these things are like exhaustive or mutually exclusive perfectly. But generally speaking, I tried to like put them into buckets within these and say like, this is how you could fundamentally think about the properties and make it good for that. And like being very fungible and divisible makes something a really good unit of account. And like, so that was kind of the framework I set up for here's how we think fundamentally about money, and we could qualitatively assess any good in the world and apply this type of a framework to it. That's
excellent, dude. I had the exact same line of thinking actually, because people always talked about, often defining money. Well, you can define it functionally or via its properties. Right. But it really helps to see how they overlap. Right. And that there are certain properties. You know what I came to actually is, have you heard of the concept of affordance? No. This is Gibson wrote a book called An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception in like the 60s or 70s. And he talked about these real fitness relationships organisms had to their environments. Yep. And that those are affordances. It's not monetary, although it has a monetary metaphor word for it. It's neither subjective nor objective, actually. It's always the betweenness, right? So the graspability of the bottle is not in the bottle or in my hand. It's between them. Right? Okay. The ant can't grasp it, and then I can't grasp Africa, as John Vervaeke likes to say. The graspability exists between organism and their environment. They're neither subjective nor objective, but the thing about money that was interesting, the affordances, which are basically monetary properties, right? They all typically end in the word, the letters ability, right? Divisibility, recognizability, portability. Exactly. Yeah. These are, because money's only used by humans, that it is actually an affordance that's exclusive to humans so far as we know, these monetary properties. And so, mapping those things together, you're basically showing the evolutionary advantage of a tool base, I guess, as it actually relates to human beings' utility. Yeah. So, anyways, let's go into that maybe. So it sounds like we had the commonality. It was the view on the centralized power structures of the world that were elementary and important to our orange pilling. Yeah. You needed to see that Bitcoin as the solution. So can we just talk about that? Like, what is centralized power? How do we get it? How does it even relate to Bitcoin broadly?
So like before pre-Bitcoin, and it's always a little tricky to remember exactly what you thought at a certain point in time, but like pre-Bitcoin for me, I definitely got much deeper into a lot of these things once I got into Bitcoin. I think that for me, it was, I'm getting my like standard Keynesian economics education. And I remember the first time I was taught about the risk-free rate. And I was just laughing. I remember in class, I was like, what does that even mean? This is like,
I was so pissed off at my economics professor. I was like, what?
Yeah. It's great. And like, this is being taught in all these, different areas of the risk-free rate. And it just happens to be US government debt. That's the one, that's where there isn't risk. And it's really funny, but there were certain things that I was reading about in these curriculums where I was just like, I definitely don't buy this. And I understood interest rates are prices, and to centrally manipulate these things is the precise opposite of what should be happening. Prices are information for us to be acting upon, and to, implement any sort of price control is it doesn't allow us to conduct the market in the most efficient manner. And doing that in the most important pricing mechanism in the world, the price of time that we have, is going to completely it's going to litter all the other markets that we have with what you're doing to this price itself.
Right.
And so like that was kind of my thinking is this is wrong. You know, I know this is wrong. I don't know what good looks like, but I know that we're screwing a lot of things up.
For sure.
And central banking shouldn't exist from that perspective. We should have private markets determining what rates are. And that was kind of always my perspective. I think that, you know, as I got into Bitcoin and I believed and understood more about, like, I understood that central banks were a result of, you know, being able to perpetually finance it, or not perpetually, but finance a deficit until, you know, it's not sustainable anymore.
Until hyperinflation.
Until hyperinflation, yeah. And so I think that, but, you know, I got like, when I quit my job to get into Bitcoin is when I was like, okay, I want to get really deep into banking history because I know that these things exist, but like, I just want to really see what went on. And that's when I started reading a lot more into just the history of central banking in the West. One thing that I've never really gotten into is banking in the East. And that's kind of an overlooked side of banking history that I've always wanted to look into. But I remember when I was reading about it and I was like, okay, well, everything we're looking at today is really predicated upon the evolution that happened in the West.
So true, yeah.
But nonetheless, there were interesting things happening on the other side of the world as well.
Right.
And then I, you know, and that's what I was getting into when I wrote the book. And then after that, I got a lot more into free banking when I was trying to, and that was really just a product of trying to dig into the questions of fractional reserve, because a lot of Bitcoiners were debating, will Bitcoin be full reserve? Will we have debt on a Bitcoin standard? All these different topics. And I just wanted to get a lot more clear on what the history was for how debt emerged in private markets with the most minimal amount of government interference. And then what the natural trends towards centralization were from that.
Right. Would it be fair to describe like the movement towards centralization? I mean, the problem in my view, let me try to reframe this, the mutability that comes along with it, right? All the rules constantly changing and morphing. And so players aren't able to form long-term strategies in the economic games of business.
Oh,
and
yeah,
such
it's
like
interesting.
That. And so, and it doesn't always just centralize, also things decentralize. That opens up a lot of that. There's a lot more freedom and you tend to get economic expansion in those times. You know, early United States, Hong Kong, all these little case studies on that. And then because I wanted to tie that into the immutability, which is we didn't hit on that property actually. And how it is a discovery. It's a one-time discovery. Like well, I don't know. I want to hear what you have to say about it. It's big breakthrough.
I think that it's interesting. I from the perspective of like, is immutability of a system a one-time discovery? It's like within this context, it's not something where I want to speak.
You can't say it with definitiveness.
It's not something where I want to say like it's
but
only
it's hard
ever
to imagine how.
But what I know is that for this specific use case with Bitcoin of an immutable aspect of the system, I don't know how anything else emerges with the same thing. And for all intents and purposes, it's basically something where Bitcoin had to emerge as this. It couldn't have been taken seriously. That's the biggest benefit in the world, that it had a decade where nobody took it seriously. That allowed it to grow in all the right ways until until a bunch of competition and capital started stepping into the industry. And when it was just like this goofy little internet weird thing that people were using, or is even, it was used for drug trade and all these things, that's exactly the environment it needed to actually foster a decentralized network before it was too late. And that's kind of like, the immaculate conception or whatever, how people like to qualify it. Everything else that's emerged since has emerged under a competitive environment. And that means that they have to move past just like bootstrapping a network from a hobbyist group of people that love freedom to, we need a foundation, we need capital providers, we need marketing initiatives, we need all these things to happen. Otherwise nobody's going to, we don't have time on our side anymore. And that creates this competitive environment that it requires centralization to have any sort of success in any competing technology against Bitcoin. It can't just grow naturally anymore.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, and then, the only actually historical allegory I found for it, like the invention of something that seems like it won't change forever. Actually, there's two, the number 0 and the wheel. You know,
Yeah,
like
okay.
things you kind of just invent once. And it seems like 0% inflation money is kind of like, you're just going to get that once,
Right,
basically.
exactly. Yeah.
Because money's winner take all and all these things.
Yep.
Have you ever wanted to live in an off-grid community with complete food, energy, and water independence? If so, then you need to check out the farm at Okefenokee. The farm is a pioneering community designed to foster longevity and well-being, eliminating elements that detract from these goals. At the farm, the convergence of nature, nutritious food, a supportive community, and the ethos of slowing down is unparalleled. Positioned at the gateway to the UNESCO World Heritage-nominated Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, the farm at Okefenokee stands as a testament to a lifestyle that truly nurtures health and happiness. Unlike conventional housing developments where a token communal garden may suffice, the farm itself is the community. Small, intimate micro-villages seamlessly integrate into the fabric of a sprawling agricultural community. So if you're interested in joining this off-grid community, then go to okefarm.com today to learn more about becoming a member. Make sure to tell them that I sent you for a $21,000 discount on their custom cabin pricing. Again, go to okefarm.com to learn more about joining this revolutionary regenerative agriculture community. iCoin Technology has released a slick new hardware wallet. It looks like a mini iPhone with a high-res 3-inch touchscreen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, and no GPS. It is an air-gapped hardware wallet which uses QR codes and a camera to communicate with the Bitcoin network. It has a built-in camera which is required for air-gap operation, and it has an optional Bluetooth compatibility. It's really a brand new user interface and user experience for a Bitcoin hardware wallet. iCoin makes self-custody accessible, easy to use, and non-intimidating. It even comes with an optional custom iCoin thermal printer so you can print out the private key and its associated QR code when you're setting up the wallet. This makes setup quick and simple. Also, it is easy to restore the wallet just by reading the seed phrase QR code with the wallet camera. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like the iCoin wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. So go to iCointechnology.com/breedlove today for 30% off the purchase of this sleek new hardware wallet. Again, that's iCointechnology.com/breedlove. There's this evolutionary thing with Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin itself evolves. It seems like, well, technology in general evolves. We often use the word innovation instead of evolution, but there's this whole idea. I tried to capture this in few words once, and it's inspired by a lot of the thinkers I'm sure we'll talk about, that evolution is biological innovation and innovation is non-biological evolution. Like same processes occurring in different substrates, right? One is in metal and plastic and all the things we make stuff out of, and the other's in flesh and bone and blood, basically. And there's this idea of the constructal law that I wanted to introduce as well. Just like, how do we start to frame like this idea of emergence, I guess, where it's organic. You just described it, right? Bitcoin had this emergent, organic smoke screen in its early days because everyone didn't take it seriously. So how is this, although Bitcoin's a technological system in kind of the hard sense, you know, there's real hardware mining this stuff. It's very organic. It's very nature-like. So if you could just speak to that.
Like, I think that's a great way of like applying this constructal law idea, because like constructal law is, you know, more like very an acutely defined physics definition, but like broadly speaking, it just means that a system Systems that tend to grow the most are those that follow the path of least resistance. And everything that we see naturally, rivers are just water flowing downhill towards the path of least resistance over time. And trees are just following where the sunlight is and where the rainwater is. And they're just constantly following a path of least resistance. And all these natural systems that we have build out in that sort of a way. And like looking at the emergence of Bitcoin, that's how it emerged. It followed the path of least resistance. And it was, you know, its initial, its primary product market fit in the early years was in drug trade, because that was the path of least resistance for it. And that allowed, because there wasn't, to the point where, you know, just discussing this competitive environment and other big form of resistance against it, because that just didn't exist. It was allowed to flow. It was allowed to flow in all these different areas over time. And it could expand far enough until now it's, you know, being more encumbered. So we have like the trunk is established at this point. And the roots are deep and they're wide, and like that's not something that's going to change. And now, and this is because we go into the constructal law in our investment philosophy for my venture fund, and we're like, what is it, you know, what are we doing when we're investing in Bitcoin startups within the Bitcoin ecosystem? And we use the tree is the best analogy for it, because everybody talks about it in layers, and there's value in the layered analogy for specific context. But if we're talking about Bitcoin as a whole, it's like Bitcoin is this trunk with a bunch of roots that are laid very wide throughout the world. We're investing in branches that are growing off of it. And we're making bets that this was a good branch to be investing in at this point in time. And the branches are going to grow much more quickly than the trunk is over the long term, but they're also going to die more quickly. Some are going to be established for the long term. And there's all these analogies that we can kind of draw to it. But yeah, the constructal law around the system is that the fact that we could only have that trunk really happen once, and now we can invest in branches and things like that. But when cryptocurrencies are kind of trying to emerge as like a new trunk, it's just like, that's just not going to happen. Like, you know, you gotta join up with the trunk that exists, and you can become a branch of some sort. And that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, that's just, I mean, it is the right metaphor, because you typically hear guys talk about something like selling the picks and shovels, right? Is something a lot of people say.
I say that a lot in investor meetings, because it's easy for them to get.
Exactly.
It's a terrible analogy.
Yeah, but it's not, but the tree is much better, right? Because it is an organic system that's unfolding, and that's how it functions. It's a great way to look at it. Also, maybe the 10 years or whatever that a seed of a tree spins in the dark. You know, Bitcoin spent, to your earlier point,
interesting.
It's spending a lot of time in the dark. You know, no one cares about it. That is one of the most important elements of Bitcoin's success, is that it was born into a world where no one gave a shit about it.
Totally.
For 10 years, right? That if people were really hyper focused on crypto like they are now, like it probably would have made it out of the cradle.
Right. It's a sly roundabout way that it had to happen.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, the tree is a great one. And the other thing, like the constructal law, so where I encountered this concept is, as I mentioned to you, Adrian Bijan. Hope I'm saying his name correctly.
I've been saying Bijan, but I don't know.
Bijan. Yeah. I read his book, The Physics of Life. He's written some other ones I've purchased but not read yet. And he was just in a very heavy physics sense, a rigorous physics sense, tying in the dynamics of evolution and innovation, and how it's like kind of one continuous flow structure. He calls it like the man and machine flow structure. I don't know.
Interesting. I'm not sure.
I forgot the exact term, but he describes like man and machine sort of being those one organism in a way. Like we're sort of cybernetic, which clearly like surrounded by technology all the time, wearing technology. I have a screw in my finger, you know, like we are these natural born cyborgs. So I found that to be a very, very interesting book. But it's so strange to me. So there's that emergence, right? Which we often associate. Well, this is evolution, right? There's emergence. Nature's creating more variation, more species, more experiments. And then there's the selection pressures of the environment. And this is, you know, killing off the organisms that aren't fit, basically. So back to the affordances thing. And I keep toying with this idea of things are neither subjective nor objective, and like things that are in between. Evolution seems to be like one of them to me. Like, again, I was talking to Matt Ridley the other day, as I told you. He has a book on sexual selection recently. So largely females, which are engaged in sexual selection, are subjectively deciding what the next generation of offspring will be, right? They're choosing mates. So there's a subjective element to evolution, but then there's the objective selection pressures of the environment. And so this between reality and evolution itself, like the more important or deep a concept is, the more beyond pure subject-object duality it is. seems to be. So, and then I just wanted to like play with Bitcoin in those terms too. Like what is money? What is money? It is, where is it on this subject object dichotomy in your view?
I think it makes sense that it's objective at the highest level of the hierarchy and becomes more subjective as you, going back to the tree analogy, as the roots expand further, it becomes more subjective within a more like localized context in which it's used, right? Like it's something where there's certain universal highest, strongest, best forms of money that exist like globally.
Right.
And then as you get into more local areas, given the constraints that exist within those, only, much smaller markets start to emerge for more unique or interesting, like, cigarettes being used as money in a prison.
Right.
And hyperinflationary local currencies because they're most removed from participation in the global system. So they're basically forced to be using these government currencies, or they resort to barter or, poor local goods that like literally primitive money types.
Right. Path of least resistance.
Right. Path of least resistance. Exactly. Yeah.
That's so interesting. An extension of what I was trying to say earlier about affordances, that, again, they're neither subjective nor objective. But for money, because it's exclusively used by humans, that the properties of money actually do seem to be what we would typically call objective, right? There are objectively better monies and worse monies, which I'm sure you would agree with, right? Bitcoin has better monetary properties objectively than a banana, for instance. Because only, it's not a fitness relationship between any organism. It's like there's only one organism that uses it. So I thought that too is just an interesting way to look at it. It's like, yes, money is subjectively selected by each market actor, and they're expressing their preferences through action to choose what money is. But there is objectively something that typically the Schelling point coalesces around.
Right.
And that's what you're basically betting on as a Bitcoiner, is you're like, hey, I see the Schelling point sooner than others.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry, that was not a question there, but I was just throwing these ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Because like it, it's kind of a question of like what makes something objective, right? At the end of the day, something is objective because there's enough consensus around it from broader society. And that's kind of what it is. It's like there's certain things where they're considered more objective qualities, and we have these affordances that are a way of assessing that. And that just like we have the highest consensus, best forms of money that exist at certain levels. And then the subjectivity of it starts to happen more at like, the leaves of the branches. But
right. So could we say then in that definition of objectivity that Bitcoin is objectively the best money there's ever been?
It's interesting. I think it's like, if we really do assess it from the affordances today, I think it's objectively the best money in most of the properties except for its acceptability now. As far as being widely accepted. And so that's one of the primary points I make in the book is that, so here's a property that exists by it, existing for a long enough period of time and spreading wide enough. If it's superior across all of the other monetary properties, then it's reasonable to assume that eventually it'll become the most widely accepted. And then once we have that, then it is objectively the best form of money. But I think that's the bet that we're making, is that because it has better fundamental properties objectively, then this final property of widely accepted usage is eventually going to happen.
Yeah. I think that's fair to say that, because obviously demand is always subjective, and you don't actually know, but you can definitely, that's what business largely is you're making bets on where that demand's going to flow.
Totally.
Right. So, let's talk about trust, because Bitcoin's also been framed. Well, Nick Szabo framed money as something like the trust minimized asset. Okay. And, Bitcoin's often called trustless or trust minimized, which is more accurate, I think. How is Bitcoin transformational to trust, and why is trust important both in money and in institutional frameworks more broadly?
So yeah, okay. I think so how I frame this in my book is trust was in primitive societies, like the primitive forms of money being used, there was actually quite a bit of commonality between those and how Bitcoin works today. There's kind of like three primary functions in which intermediaries or trusted relationships would get involved in money. And that's through its production, through its storage, and through its verification. And in primitive societies, it was pretty decentralized. Like we were using different societies were using local commodities and goods that were, had monetary properties that were naturally desirable to them to be used as a form of money. And those three intermediated functions were non-intermediated back then. It was people were finding money themselves. They're, aka producing it. They were storing money themselves, and they were verifying it amongst one another themselves. Right. So like these forms of intermediation were already decentralized. And then throughout the evolutionary process of money, we traded trust for efficiency because we found, well, we can actually get a lot better properties out of, different things. Yeah. We added more centralization to production when we went into the precious metal era. Yeah. And then we added more centralization into storage when we went into the paper money era. And we gained quite a bit of efficiency with that. With, precious metals, we gained much more scarcity, much more durability, better portability. Coinage systems were kind of their own evolution within precious metals as well. Because that was a new form of trust in the representation on the coin rather than the actual weight of metal that you were trading in. Yeah. And that was something that was manipulated, right? Yeah. And as well as dilution of the metal itself was something that was manipulated. Not everybody knew how to verify gold, because not everybody was producing gold. Right. And as people were more removed, fraud became a bigger function within these. And
man in the middle attack.
Man in the middle attack. And then paper money was, what led to, the antiquity of modern banking systems. And paper money was incredibly efficient. I mean, it was like nothing we'd ever seen, right? Like the trade-offs, we know why the market gravitated for it for very obvious reasons, because it was following technology's evolution, right? We had the printing press and we had double entry bookkeeping accounting. And then we ultimately had, the telegraph. And like with all of that innovation, paper money was moving trade all over Europe very rapidly. Right. And that just required the most significant degree of trust and storage of it. Yeah, yeah. And in these things, and this is why I spent a lot of time reading into free banking, because there's a lot I can say about, how trust works before the state ultimately gets involved in these private market trust systems. The problem is that the way the world existed historically, it was always too hard to prevent the state from being involved in these systems. And this was like one of the key ideas that I define in my book is the problem with money is that, we talked at the beginning that money is the most saleable good. And the idea I defined in my book is that, the agency problem, it's a very fundamental issue of principle and agents that, is in your Econ 101, stating that like, if you have, a conflict of interest exists between the principal is somebody asking an agent to act on their behalf. In an economic system, if there's a conflict of interest between those two, then the agent is going to act out of their self-interest and not yours as the principal. And so, the example I'll use is like, if you were to hire a courier to deliver some like legal documents on your behalf, these things are only relevant to you. There's nothing they can gain by, doing anything to them. And you're going to pay them $100 to go deliver it. Then you can be reasonably assured that they're going to make that delivery for you. Now, if you give them $100 million cash to go deliver for you, you can be reasonably assured that they're not going to deliver that for you. And they're going to take that over the $100 you're paying them. And because money is the most saleable good, you can trade it for anything else. It is the highest subject to the agency problem over any other good. Any other form of principal agent conflict of interest, when we're dealing with money, nothing is more subject to that agency problem than anything else. Yeah. And that's why the history of money is littered with conflicts of interest. And ultimately the moral hazard that results from those conflicts of interest. And that's kind of what we're talking about when we're painting the history of banking, is that all these conflicts of interest emerged in private markets when trust emerged in systems because we wanted more efficiency in our money. And when these conflicts of interest emerged, markets are naturally designed to sort these things out over the long term, and markets aren't perfect. You know, there's costs that we pay for freedom. But nonetheless, markets did sort these things out. And if you look at the history of like the most free banking systems, they actually functioned very well on behalf of people. So like the Scottish free banking system over a period of about 150 years, and you know, this has to be adjusted for whatever inflation's been since then, but it was like 32,000 pounds were lost ultimately over a 150-year period to depositors. Doesn't mean that banks didn't go bankrupt, but that's not customer deposits going away. That's just, you know, new competitor buys the bank out and somebody gets control of the equity and all of this. People aren't losing their money in these scenarios. But I mean, the Scottish free banking system, for at least the first half of it when it was much more free, it functioned relatively well on behalf of the people that were depositors in it. And I think that for the vast majority though, governments always found a way to control these systems. And like the emergence of all of this was, you know, 17th century England under the goldsmith bankers, natural phenomenon. We had the state, ironically, sadly, but, you know, we had Charles I, who had, you know, appropriated wealth that was being stored in state, officially designated areas like the London Mint. And people all wanted to pull their money out of it. And they kind of, you know, their diaspora that spread to the outside lands. And that was, well, goldsmiths had infrastructure for storing gold and other precious metals. They just had a bunch of vaults. So people started storing them in those things. It was just natural. And they economized on it. And that led to banking systems ultimately emerging in a private way. And when this process happened, you know, that's where fractional reserve banking was ultimately born, at least within the West, was in this type of a system where goldsmith bankers were giving out receipts. The receipts eventually became entrusted for trade because they're like, why do we have to go all the way to the goldsmith and get the gold out and I give it to you and you give it back to him anyways? You know?
This is all exercise in lowering transaction costs, right?
Lowering transaction
Again, the path
costs.
of least resistance. But is it unforeseen trade-offs? I mean, you're getting this trust in an institutional solution, basically a trusted solution. And then you don't realize maybe the risk you're taking until there's blow-ups.
Exactly. Because we don't have time to do these things, right? Like, I mean, I do it all the time. We're trusting people every day and everything that we're doing, the food that I eat, you know, I'm trusting the FDA. I'm trusting the incentives of the suppliers. And like, pilots, generally speaking, we can entrust these things. It works most of the time. And then sometimes it doesn't. Every now and then it's fatal and there's not much you can do about that.
Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com. I wanted to ask about the rule of law situation during the Scottish free banking era. Like, what was the state just purposely uninvolved, or how did they?
For periods of time during the first half of the system, it was in the latter half when like the Napoleonic Wars started happening that state took more control and money printing started to happen, and that was happening out of England, and that was ultimately like downstream affecting the. It's like a free banking system works when it's all a free banking system. If you start giving one area an advantage, it becomes very hard for the rest of the private market to compete against that. It's
contagious in a way, because if someone's running a fractional reserve, they will generate more profits than a full reserve.
If they can persistently do it without failing, which means the state has to be involved.
If they get subsidized, exactly.
And so, and that's kind of the problem with like free banking systems in history is they didn't exist in a vacuum. There was international competition. You know, their friends to the south in England were running the Bank of England. And so it was, I think that there was that, it's really hard for us to say, but I think there's quite a bit of spillover effects that were affecting, you know, how much people were participating in the system when there was a lot of money printing going on during wartime in England, and what the you know, second order effects were on the Scottish system from that. But like, when generally speaking, for a free banking system, there's, you know, there's about 60 different systems that are like observed as being within the, you know, categorically included of study within it. But it's really like it was the Scottish system and the Canadian system that are considered to be like the most truly like free banking systems, and a lot of others that were being muddied up very significantly by state. So like when a lot of people that are critical of free banking as a concept are talking about like the wildcat banking system in the US before our, you know, second and third, ultimately the Federal Reserve central banks. And like examples of how that system was being muddied up is it was happening on a state by state basis, but you know, they had certain like bond collateral laws, for example. Like, sure, you can be a bank, you can be a free bank, but you have to use this percentage of collateral as bonds of our state bonds. If you want to do it here. So like
that's a form of a manipulation itself.
They're completely manipulating the supply, you know, it's like an embargo or something. But yeah, so like there's just all these things happening. We're like, sure, we'll let you guys play this game, but you got to do these things, and it fucks up the free market incentives, and there was a lot of that happening in like free banking systems throughout history. So like the Scottish and the Canadian were kind of considered some of the most free, and that's why they're the most widely studied. But generally speaking, they allowed the banks to function and to fail and to compete against one another over time. And there's a lot of really cool things that we found of how these systems worked that kept them in check, which ultimately benefited the consumer. What was really interesting is like the practice of note dueling that would happen between banks.
Dueling.
Yeah. So the idea was like, it's like, what put a check on fractional reserve systems? And the check's ultimately like, will your bank blow up in a bank run? And what a lot of competing banks would do against each other is, because they all had to accept each other's notes, it was a natural thing that started happening. It was better for you as a bank to accept your competitors' notes because the whole system functioned better. It's just a natural
interoperability.
Interoperability started to happen because everybody won from that. And because they're all accepting notes, what they would do is, like, if there's a more direct competitor, some banks, they would hold on a concentrated set of notes from one of their competitors for a period of time, and they'd take them and go redeem them all at once. And that was like note dueling. They'd have these little they try to run bank runs on each other effectively.
That's so cool.
And it's awesome. Yeah, it would have been fun. Like, totally, it would have been fun to be a businessman. I would have liked doing that. I'm like, oh man, this might be our week. We might get them.
It's a shot across the bow, right? Because as you're saying, like, they all have the temptation to run the fractional book to generate additional profits, but then they can call each other's bluff.
Exactly. They're calling each other's bluffs. And like, it was perfect because all of this would benefit consumers. Because now this creates this incentive of, when's our competitor going to come after us with a bank run?
Incentive to be honest.
Exactly. So it all worked in the favor of the system over time. And, there's a bunch of cool, like, different, natural market phenomena that like kept the system in check. And
sorry, that's just to interrupt. That's a great case of private property keeping the system in check too, right? Like, as long as they're honoring those redemption requests, honoring those contracts, that the decentralization does self-govern.
Right.
in that way. Maybe not
Right.
perfectly. And I'm still not convinced on a market failure, by the way. I've never heard of a convincing market failure.
Yeah.
I don't want to say markets are perfect, but they seem preferable.
It's like market failure is a question of time horizon,
Yeah.
I think. I think that like, I think one of the things that never is like, I've from like an economics perspective, why I would not say like I'm a full blown libertarian is that I do think that, and I don't have like a concrete way of saying that how to quantify like the net benefit of all of it. But I think that, you know, negative externalities and natural monopolies emerge in certain ways. And the solution is redundancy and infrastructure over a long enough time horizon.
Yeah.
And then the question is like, how do we qualify the pain and the cost of, you know, subjecting private markets to that over a long enough period? And what is the state's intervention in that system ultimately to gain by, you know, foregoing that?
Yeah.
And then what's the long-term consequences of the slippery slope of state intervention in these areas? And it's like, of course, I'm generally speaking, I'm not even generally speaking, for the vast majority of cases, I'm against state intervention. But there's specific things where it's, I believe that having localized state intervention in certain systems is not like something that will persistently lead to dictatorial outcomes. It's more of a question of like when we have like federal intervention into things where we have trust busting and all of that, and you know that can lead to dictatorial outcomes.
Is it would it be fair to say non-local governance tends to be more problematic?
Completely. Yeah. Local governance is like the best thing we can ask for that doesn't benefit from the same economies of scale as federal does, which is why we don't always use it. Yeah. But
do you delineate between government and state? I've recently been, because government is such this, you need it basically. It's emergent. Right?
It's emergent.
It's emergent.
Yeah.
But as long as it's opt in, opt out, that seems to be okay. Like as long as consent still is in it, that you can opt out of it if you're getting a bad deal. That seems okay. Like, even like homeowners association right. Whereas statism seems to be something a bit more predatory.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know that there's a bright line, but I'm wondering how you think about that.
It's just like, I've never really thought much about the delineation. I've kind of used them pretty interchangeably. But I definitely think that it's a really fundamental point. The ability to opt out, right? Yeah. And this is kind of in a lot of my research around free banking, where I try to basically extrapolate, here's how these systems work back then and how this could work on Bitcoin. If we never get these whole trust minimized scaling solutions figured out, how would it work if we just had like a free banking system emerge one day? And the key thing, there's a bunch of variables that I think change things, but like the most prominent is it's going to be very easy for the system to always be an opt-out. If you are entrusting your Bitcoin to a custodial, you know, de facto banking type software is what it would look like. Then as long as you have the ability to operate in a peer-to-peer system in an efficient economic manner, that's a whole new vector of competition that we haven't seen exist in a banking system before in history, really. You know, the ability to like opt out, unless we go back to like very primitive times, it just hasn't existed. If you're a drug cartel and you want to build around a whole cash system or something, like completely obfuscate your way of life and have, you know, people with AK-47s around you all day. Like that's kind of the only examples we really see of people opting out in our current system. And so people using Bitcoin's probably better than that. And like, it is, I think that changes the competitive dynamics. It'll be like free banking on steroids because now these banks aren't just competing against each other. They're competing against a peer-to-peer system. Yeah.
And also the digitization and abstraction of it all seems will make it much more flat competitive landscape, probably even globally. Like, you know, obviously there's regulations blocking it now, but you would imagine over time as Bitcoin continues to defund central government, some of those barriers would come down.
And that's one of the other big points that I went into is, and I was kind of mentioning this earlier with like the key thing that I define is like we want these systems to have a very low marginal cost of participation. And that's one of the huge differences with how we're going to see like more custodial or shared custodial arrangements around Bitcoin in this type of a system, is that the marginal cost of participating is like a service provider in this is going to be drastically lower than anything we've seen in prior systems. Like what's the marginal cost today of I want to go start a bank in the
barrier
US?
to entry, basically.
I got to go raise $10 million and get a banking license. And I got to have very powerful friends. And today it's like people are going to have the ability to go spin up an eCash mint and just to run that in their local community for people that they trust. And like we know communities that are doing that right now. And it's like a very hobbyist thing happening today.
You get closer to that perfect competition ideal.
Exactly. It's just creating more competitive markets because software automates things. Cryptography allows us to selectively reveal information about ourselves. Like that's one of the most interesting things, is that it's hilarious that we have this system that's a public ledger that we're all operating in. It's public. And we can do that because cryptography allows us to choose that anonymity. And of course, there's a lot of, challenges to privacy. And there's things that you have to do if you want to operate in the right way, but nothing that service providers can't solve in the long term for people. And the ability for us to selectively reveal information allows us to have transparency of the system at a systemic level, while privacy at the individual micro level. That's huge. That changes the way it all works.
So cool.
Yeah.
I brought up perfect competition, and it just triggered this thought in me about, I just want to hear your thoughts on this. I've reflected on Bitcoin as perhaps the first case of perfect information too, because we perfectly fixed and predictable money supply. It's asymptotically diminishing. It's fully diluted cap table, however you want to look at it. But we've never had that with any money before, right? Right. Gold, you just had this probabilistic assurance, I guess, which I guess with Bitcoin too, it's ultimately probabilistic, to be clear. But the strongest version of the closest thing to perfect information we've ever had. I don't know if you've thought, and often we call it truth, right? Bitcoin is a truth ledger, a truth machine, et cetera.
Right.
What are your reflections on that?
Totally. I agree. That was like, and people talk about this ad nauseum, but that was one of the primary distinction. That's what like kind of the last piece that Satoshi figured out is up until this point, people were all using like different theories of auction mechanisms to determine what the supply, and some of like the proto Bitcoins that were created with Szabo, Wei Dai, and other predecessors. There are all these different forms of like auction that were being created for like how we're going to create new supply, and that was like the big distinction that Satoshi made, is like, let's just fix the damn thing. And let's use the difficulty adjustment to accomplish this over a predetermined schedule. And that allows us to have a subsidy up front before like it gets to maturity of the mining system, where fees are going to be effective to compensate for transactions throughout the network.
Incentivizing front running by everyone.
Right. Yeah. And it was super cool. And by fixing the supply in this sort of a way, it's if we think, so like, let's compare this to, this is a much bigger question what it leads to, but like, let's compare that idea of we fix the supply. And it's like, the question is like, does that mean we've now fixed the supply of money? And this goes back to the point about what is an objective, subjective form of money that we're talking about earlier, where like we have these, and there's somebody who's conceptualized this into a framework. I can't remember, but it's like, there's like a hierarchy of monies effectively.
Oh, Nick Bhatia.
Okay.
Layered money. I'm just guessing.
Well, yeah. That's okay. So I don't. Was he there? I think that there's a more original.
Probably he wrote a book called Layered Money.
Right.
It's a recent writer. Yeah. Not.
I thought that there's another. Maybe I'm mistaken, but there's before Nick. I'm sure he's probably drawing on those conceptually. But in any event, it's just like there's a hierarchy of money, and we can have the most like trustless, purest, best form of money. And then there's other forms of money that emerge that are more trusted, which are, where there's greater ease of use. And like in a Bitcoin world, it's like we have this fixed supply of like the best form of money. And then the question is like, will there be other form of money that exists? And I think the big question about that is credit.
Yeah.
How much credit will exist? Because credit is another form of money.
Right. Promises will always exist, basically. So there'll be some credit At what scale is the question?
At what scale is the question?
Yeah.
How much, and with the way the economy works today, we can be like with near certainty that scale will be drastically smaller than how it's been structurally incentivized to expand for a century. Exactly. So credit is going to create the malleability effectively of the supplies, because all it is the way that I like talk about a lot of this in my book, that it helped me understand money more when I thought about it from this framework, is the value of money is hard for people to grasp because it's implicit. And, if you remove money from our system today, we've created such a complex form of specialization around the world that like the system actually wouldn't function. So you can't even like think about it today.
Exactly.
If we go back to more simplified societies, if you remove money from the whole system, now we revert to barter, and the time and the energy, ultimately capital accumulation that is lost because of all the time we have to spend actually just trading with each other is massive. And if we remove it today, because of how much capital we've built from specialization in these different trade relationships, like our system would literally crumble. But because the more efficient forms of money, the more we reduce that implicit cost of trade amongst everything. And through that process, that changes the opportunity cost of time that we have now. And we can spend that building things that, increase the standard of living and lower the cost of living. And
lower time preference.
And lower time preference. And we so like that's kind of the ultimate goal here. And then when we have these forms of money that are better or worse at doing things like that, credit is something that allows us to, it's a form of money that I think will always exist because it works in the opposite way that commodity money works. Commodity money allows us to accept value today and move it into the future. And credit allows us to take value from the future and move it to today. And because of that, it's so much more valuable because the future is uncertain.
Yes. And as long as the savers are consenting to it, that's the problem, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's like one of the big things is when you really break down what credit is, it's like fractional reserve is, all it is one mechanism for credit expansion. So like in one paper that I was writing, it's the question of will fractional reserve emerge in like some sort of Bitcoinized world is like, it's a question of will private markets choose it, right? And the reasons is like, well, why? If we can get credit without having fractional reserve, then we can have full reserve type lending systems. We can just have a bunch of credit funds that open up. We can have direct peer-to-peer. And I kind of put together this framework of like, there's like peer-to-peer credit that will be exchanged, but there's, it reaches points of resistance and it reaches points of resistance around trust in certain relationships with people, right? People lend things to their neighbors, to their families, for better or for worse. And there's a point of resistance in how wide that can actually scale over time. And then if we get into like, okay, well, now let's add intermediaries to this, because not only is there resistance in how that scales within localized trusted relationships within people, but people aren't specialized in lending. So they don't know what to look for. So it's probably not going to work out as well for them. And there's going to be a poor return yielded to them over time from that. Adding in intermediaries for lending of credit allows us to specialize in that and put some sort of productivity towards our savings beyond what we get from a deflationary money. And when we have intermediaries introduced, then it's a question of, well, now that system's not just limited by the trust that's bound in a local community, but it's limited by the capital that's being put into it if you assume it's fully reserved. And even when you get into that, it's just like the concept of what is fractional reserve. It's just like that now there's maturity mismatching. It's actually really hard to not go insolvent as a bank in all situations. Because just lending in general, even in a fully reserved system, it gets murky and you're still taking on risk by lending. So unless you create a bank where everybody has to have a time deposit account and you can only pull your money out at certain periods of time, so you're never going to get perfect certainty around that. And then even with that, your loans can fail. And so it's basically like, so once we introduce intermediaries, assuming it was full reserve, it would expand to the degree that that the amount of capital and savings that have been deposited in the banks. Now, if we go into fractional reserve, can expand even further, the degree of credit, the ceiling for credit expansion, basically. And the question's like, well, what if banks do 99% reserves, 98%, 97. You know, what is the market level of optimal fractional reserve? Because what happens when they can earn an economic return by pushing more credit into the economy? And all that is based on how much credit can people demand and the banks not go bankrupt. And only the market can answer that question. And we just don't really know what that is.
Somehow this occurred to me recently that it feels like the natural order, if I may use that term, of things is that you have entrepreneurs in a more ideal decentralized free market system. You have entrepreneurs go into the market. The ones that are successful accumulate capital over time, obviously. And then at some point, maybe they want to generate yield on that capital. So they're just kind of lending it back to the younger guys that are coming up that don't necessarily have the capital to take the risk, but they have the idea and the blood, sweat, and tears and all that. And so maybe there would be, as you're describing, like a market rate for even maybe possibly inflationary currency, right? Like maybe a large group of people sign up to be like, oh yeah, we're going to, I don't know, lend out some percentage of this in a fractional way to try to generate additional yield. And let those things compete. Right. Rather than central planning the whole thing. That's where the catastrophe comes in. Right. Because there's no competition keeping them honest.
Basically. And then, you know, the failure of the centralized coordination across all of it is the systemic risk that never existed in the first place and not been interfered with.
How does this relate to price signal distortion, though? Do you think the market then sort of chooses a level of price signal distortion as well?
All that means is like
or this would probably feed the price signal, honestly, I guess.
So what I don't like about these conversations is like when there's like economists talking about a lot of this, economists like to think, you know, because they're forced to think about everything at a systemic level, the, you know, alternative human action, micro level of decision-making is neglected in certain ways. And I think like, no market actor is making decisions being conscious of what's happening systemically. You know, generally speaking, people are making decisions of, I like this interest rate and I feel like the risk is
kind of thing.
And I think that like when it comes to price signals as it relates to all of this, it's just how much credit exists within the economy is going to be impacting what interest rates ultimately are. So it's really a question of all we really know is that for us to attempt to implement systemic controls on that system is ultimately what's going to distort the price signal. If credit emerges naturally, whether it's fractional reserve or not, if credit emerges naturally within an economy, that's going to be impacting pricing signals. That's just, they're looking at the interest rates too. You know, it's just, it's the other side of the market. And it's adjusting naturally over time. So like when people talk about like the elasticity of Bitcoin and like people are critical over its elasticity, it's just like credit is the elasticity.
That's exactly the conclusion I reached with Jeff Snyder. He was on for a long series. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah.
And he was anti-Bitcoin for that reason. Well, where's the elasticity? Sometimes you need it. And then I think we arrived at that conclusion though. That, if Bitcoin enables free banking has this inbuilt, if elasticity is demanded, well, then you'll have it.
Have it.
It'll be there.
Like it's not something it's not keeping me up at night. You know, like it's either going to happen or it's not. This isn't like some sort of fundamental issue. Bitcoin's just at the top of the pyramid. Like you want the best final assurance form of money, go get it. But if you can't do that, then you're going to have to settle for credit. And tons of people, to your point, there's always going to be economic mismatching. There's going to be some genius who is an excellent salesman, who is going to be an incredibly successful entrepreneur who has no money at all from a poor neighborhood. And that guy is going to make some capitalist who has a ton of money and, you know, nothing but time, very rich for giving him the initial capital he needed to go pursue that enterprise. And like credit's always going to be moving this value from the future to the present. And these are all good things. And that's why I'm just not as concerned about like these elasticity arguments that people focus on. I feel like with like the people that are focused more on banking and how the fiat banking system functions today, it's a lot of people that are really obsessing over the mechanics of this ridiculous system that we have as it is. I don't care to spend too much time on it. Like I spend enough time to like get it. And now I'm kind of like, okay, got it. Like,
it's a mess.
It's a mess. Like, you know, I'm not going to study it every month, you know, and we got cooler stuff we're working on now too. But like, I think that it's, People get caught up too much in like semantics of what is and isn't quantitative easing and like what is directly.
I get frustrated with that too.
Exactly.
It's like it's all fucking money printing.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I think the quickest way to like answer a lot of questions in these debates is, okay, so if the Federal Reserve is not directly, printing money by your measures, then remove them from the equation and describe the system again.
Yeah.
How does it work? It doesn't, because they indirectly incentivize. Exactly. Yeah. They indirectly incentivize it.
That's a great way to look at it.
Yeah. And then you can't make those arguments anymore. So it's because they obsess about the mechanics and not the actual indirect consequences of them.
Right.
That's when it's like, it really doesn't matter whether it happens at the primary dealer level or the commercial level.
And I've always wondered about that. What is the obsession with the mechanics when you see the disastrous consequences? It's like, what is to be gained by obsessing over the mechanics? Like, I mean, that sounds almost silly when you say it that way. It's like, obviously the details matter, but in this case, that's maybe it's oversimplification, but like it is at the end of the day, it is all money printing.
I think,
whether it's at the commercial bank level, the central bank level, how the incentives work, like the money, look at the fucking money supply. It expands rapidly.
Yeah.
And that's very problematic.
Right. And then the question of what is the money supply and not is just also a semantic thing. It's really just, is trade occurring more rapidly and how much trust and credit exists throughout the system? And we know that that's systematically incentivized at a global level. Yeah. And so we just know that that's all, and for us to contract any of that, it's expanded so far. We've taken steroids for so long that, we're not producing testosterone anymore. So like the whole thing's got to crumble or we just keep shoving it in. And like, that's the point that we're at. Yeah.
It's an addiction in the realest sense.
Right.
Like the reciprocal narrowing is what John Vervaeke uses to describe it, where it gives the example of the alcoholic that has a beer, so he goes into work late the next day, so he has more problems at work, so he has 2 beers that night, and the situation gets worse and worse and worse. The debt spiral is that. And then yet we seem to keep rationalizing. I consider Keynesian economics to be this like institutionalized rationalization for the addiction to money printing. It's a pseudoscientific, which you probably learned, like I'm ashamed to say I was taught a lot as you probably were in school. And like, it makes sense. Econ 101 makes a lot of sense. But by the time you get into like 301,
it's
201, it's bullshit.
Yeah, let's look at all these models that we can't measure.
It's just mathematical theater. Like, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I remember getting into like the macro 2 and 3 and stuff, and it's just like, all right, what are we doing here? It's not interesting at all.
Is it fair to say that's a real addiction? Like it's a real addiction. That's the real consequence of the addiction.
This ties back
because I always think about how pernicious that is. If the money printing is the addiction, and then the proceeds stolen from the money printing are used to fund Keynesian pseudoscience.
I think it's like people just get really. It happens. Everybody does it to some degree in certain ways, but like, you ever been obsessed with a project or something so much that you get lost up in a detail about it and you end up burning hours trying to figure out this little nuance of it.
Of course.
And then you like lose sight of the whole big picture in the first place. And it's
overfitting.
Like, there's a bunch of like academics that are doing that at a very large scale with like trying to apply statistical modeling. And, and the incentives that they have been messed with at a centralized level. Like that's one of the big problems is that the system of grants in academia are not incentivizing them to find answers to problems that matter.
That's right.
They're incentivizing them to appeal to the state. And because of that, there's this huge conflict of interest with academia. And that's why they're producing research on a bunch of things that nobody cares about. Like I remember before I took classes, I would read some of my professors' like research. And there were so many things where I was just like, why did you spend time writing about this? Nobody cares about these things, And they're not really incentivized to care. They're incentivized to get the next grant.
And
so to appeal to their peers. Right.
Don't they just, isn't it just frequency of publication?
Frequency of publication.
So it's like the more esoteric or weird your paper is, the less likely people are going to read it and judge it.
Exactly.
And if they're getting incentivized on frequency of publication, maybe that's not fair. They probably get incentivized on citations as well. I'm guessing. There's a lot.
I mean, I think that there's a bunch of different ways you can look at it. There's frequencies, like the university might look at it from that perspective. I think from more like, if you're playing in the big boy games, from anecdotal conversations I've had with people in this world, like if you're playing in the big boy games, you want to go get a $25 million grant with like, 4 other people, and you're going to do like a, 10-year research project on this. It's a huge political game. It's topical. You're networking. You're going to cocktail parties. You know, you have to have a history of publication associated with this area. Obviously, you have to have the expertise, but like you have to show alignment with these things. You're schmoozing for government money. Effectively.
Got it. That makes sense.
And it's crazy.
Would you rather have 1 Bitcoin today or 2 Bitcoin a few years from now? Bitcoin mining is a tried and true strategy for accumulating Bitcoin. Over a 2 to 4 year time frame, successful miners have consistently accumulated more Bitcoin than they otherwise would with a traditional dollar cost average strategy. Blockware mining as a service enables you to start mining Bitcoin from your laptop. Blockware handles everything from securing the miners to sourcing low-cost power to configuring the mining pool. They do it all. Plus, with Blockware's one-of-a-kind mining marketplace, you can buy and sell live Bitcoin miners with just a few keystrokes. In this marketplace, buyers get to purchase live machines at vetted facilities, enabling them to mine with zero lead time. And sellers get the opportunity to liquidate their machines and hosting contracts at will. This means you can mine Bitcoin with zero long-term commitment and high liquidity on your mining rigs. Blockware will even cover your energy bill for 1 week per mining rig when you sign up at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. Again, that's 1 free week of Bitcoin mining at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. And on top of this offer, you can also use code BREEDLOVE to get $100 off your first mining rig with Blockware Solutions. Bitcoin custody is evolving. Both self-custody and single third-party custody come with significant risk and trade-offs. Onramp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your setup. Onramp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated cold storage multi-sig vault guarded by 3 independent institutional-grade custodians, none of which that have unilateral control over your assets. More than just security, Onramp simplifies inheritance and estate planning, ensuring your Bitcoin wealth moves seamlessly to your loved ones without the risk and complexities of self-custody. Easily designate beneficiaries right in the Onramp dashboard, eliminating the need for unreliable treasure maps or other complex key sharing schemes. You can also avoid the probate process and ensure your heirs receive their Bitcoin securely with legal title transfers designed to keep your wealth intact for generations. As Bitcoin continues to appreciate, Onramp helps you seamlessly access financial services, from inheritance and insurance to trading, loans, IRAs, and more, all without compromising on security. And importantly, the onboarding process is fast and frictionless. I set up my own Onramp account, and it was far easier than dealing with hardware wallets or traditional self-custody setups. The team walked me through everything step by step, making sure I had a secure, reliant setup for my Bitcoin wealth. Secure your generational wealth with confidence. Schedule a consultation with the Onramp team today at onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. Again, that's onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. I mean, I'm pretty sure this is, you could fact check me on it, but I think central banks are the #1 employers of these PhD economics.
Oh, interesting.
Professor,
I'm
not
not
professors,
sure,
but they're advisors, think tanks, all these things.
Well, they just had like the layoffs or something with one of the Federal Reserve branches, I think.
Oh, I didn't hear about that.
Yeah, I'm nearly certain it was like there's a lot of employees at these places, like way more than I would guess, like thousands of people. Yeah. And it's like, don't you guys just push a button?
Yeah.
Like,
You just guard the big red button.
Yeah.
Just how that is, I mean, that's one of the clearest pathways to establish the connection between the corruption of money and the corruption of academia in this case, right? It's like, well, clearly look at who they're graduating. Who's the employer? Where does the employer get their money? Oh, they are in the money printing business.
Yep.
Wouldn't it be useful for them to establish a academic paradigm that justified and supported that business that they're in, rather than call it what it is?
Right.
So yeah, that one's pretty obvious to me, I guess, as far as looking at how the corruption of money corrupts everything.
Yep.
let's talk about, I guess we said we're going to go into energy, and like this is energy and game theory. It's another very interesting aspect of Bitcoin, and I don't want to say underappreciated, but broadly underappreciated. By Bitcoiners, I think we appreciate this, that it provides this perpetual global bounty program and incentive for cheaper and cheaper to bring cheaper and cheaper energy sources online, basically over time. And so also stranded energy sources, you know, it provides a path of least resistance to monetize.
We're finding more leaves out there.
Yes, exactly. So what are your views? And this, again, because energy is so fundamental, right? It's the number one input to every economic process. Like lowering the cost of energy is the equivalent to increasing aggregate wealth. So like, boom, big win for Bitcoin right there alone. What are your views on that? And again, people broadly don't seem to understand that when it's such kind of an obvious thing. Yeah.
So I guess probably the biggest thing that I'll be talking about with the, you know, effectively stranded energy argument around Bitcoin. So one, this is probably my favorite criticism to get about Bitcoin, that Bitcoin's bad for the environment or consumes a lot of energy. It's because it is probably the biggest dunk of a response we could have with just like a ton of verifiable information. But like, you know, before you get into the actual arguments behind it, the primary argument is on like a moral level. Bitcoin consumes too much energy, therefore it's bad. Then to make an argument like that, it requires you to stack rank consumption of energy.
Yes.
And what is and is not morally okay. And who is that subjective? Is there an objective way to say this?
Exactly.
And is it okay for Christmas lights or for video games or for all these other use cases, but not for what you do? And guaranteed that anybody who makes that argument has probably got Christmas lights and plays video games or something of the sort. And, but nonetheless, like when you put the moral aspect of it aside, it's just not even a question worth answering from that perspective. When the most ironic thing about people who would make these arguments about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is going to be the greatest enabler of renewable energy sources over the long term. That's what's ironic about it. It's like you misunderstand it so poorly that you're shooting yourself in the foot. I'm watching you piss on your shoes right in front of me. Like it's crazy. And like one day you're gonna feel very foolish about this. So I love it when they bring it out because it's just like, well, what's the primary two problems with renewable energy? It's intermittent and it's distributed. And until we have like a perfect form of storage for energy capacity, which has been a very challenging problem that's stagnated for decades. Until we have something like that, then the ideal buyer is a buyer of energy who's on demand and on site. And Bitcoin miners are the only people in the world who are that type of a buyer. Now we're unlocking all the stranded energy around the world. And I think that and it's great for like companies like Gridless, right, down in Africa, where like, not only is it doing that, but by unlocking these pockets of stranded energy, often what we're seeing is that these exist in areas of the world where the communities that are local to them and control their resources can benefit significantly from monetizing this asset.
Power to the people.
And it's from like a human rights perspective, all these things, like the way that it's going to allow wealth accumulation, the furthest edges of the branches, it's really powerful. And it's like there's all these knock-on effects from it that we're just beginning to see and people are starting to document and market. And so not only to like the more like liberal minded types that are against it from an energy perspective, but from a human rights perspective, how much it's going to be helping people. And, we're really lucky to have guys like Gladstein that are like advocating for this within those communities and saying like, you guys are completely dead wrong and this is foolish.
It's funny how they do go hand in hand, right? The moral argument and the actual physics argument in a way, right? The more integral the private property people have and the way they can monetize these stranded energy sources, which are presumably further away from centralized control and manipulation. So the tree is branching out, right, as a result of Bitcoin economically. That the practical and the moral are in strong alignment. I've always thought that's gets back to kind of the nature argument about Bitcoin, how it's something intertwined with our human nature as well, that it's and there's a great question there. To what extent does Bitcoin bend human nature in the right direction?
Right. This goes back to, the chat we're having kind of before we started recording of like my perspective. It's cool because you brought this up, and I've really never heard anybody else bring up that point. But I was having this conversation. I think that I think like part of like a big part of like, you know, male development, or even, you know, not even male, just like, you know, development in life is when people learn, you know, they develop certain relationships of trust with other people and expectations for that in their lives. And then, and people get to a certain level where they learn to, you know, they learn you know, you go through puberty and people's incentives change and sex becomes a much bigger part of the world. And the competition amongst peers becomes a much bigger deal. And people start to betray one another much more. And then people have these trust issues that they develop throughout their lives because of it. And like, there's certain stages of like emotional development that people go through where, you know, at a certain point people trust much less. And I think that like you get to certain points of understanding where, when you develop these perspectives of trust, and like, I think people get, when it comes to more of like an intellectual understanding of it, it's like, okay, I get to this point in my life where you know, going back to when I was saying I had like a nihilistic perspective on like how the system worked. And I think I had a pretty nihilistic perspective on human nature as well. Yeah. And it's like, it's just like, oh, like, you know, from like atheism to like other thoughts about the world, you kind of
rational atheism.
Rational atheism. And it's like, you get to this point where it's like, okay, people can do bad things and we're aware of that. If their incentives aren't aligned. I think that I think when you like see the bottom and you get to that point, it's not like you're red pilled. It's more like you're black pilled. Like you've gotten past the extent of just realizing there's a problem. You understand really like you understand it at a meta level of the fundamental drivers around why all of these things happen in the first place. And it's like, okay, people can be terrible people, and pretty much all of us have those characteristics.
And that you're a person is the other strong, and
that you are that too.
Scary revelation that goes with that. Yeah.
And if you put me on an island and you start starving me, what I'm capable of are terrible things. Yeah. And that's just a reality that you come to. And it's just like, okay, so people's morality is subject to circumstance. And then it's like, okay, well, what impacts that circumstance? And ultimately it comes down to fulfillment of needs and wealth. And if one thing I've always thought is just like the whole world peace belief of like, when could something utopian vision happen? When everybody has whenever they want it. It just, it you know, gets rid of the idea that there should, you know, that we can conflict over anything.
A hyper functional free market, basically.
We need like a technological singularity. We need abundance of everything. And if you can snap your fingers and have whatever you want, then there's no reason to really conflict with people over resources anymore. We need pure abundance for that to happen. And that's what will make people be really good people over the long term. But I think it's like, I learned at a certain point not to be like very nihilistic about these perspectives. It's just like, no, it's just reality. And I think one of the biggest things that when like very like liberal types are like, you should be empathetic. It's just like, I think true empathy really comes from understanding just how terrible people are. I think that it comes from, if you understand that you and everybody else around you is actually capable of horrible things as well as really good things, depending on your circumstance, you become so much more considerate when people are actually behaving in a certain way, because it departs your belief in that being it from you to the circumstance that you're under. And that was like one of the, I think like the big change, you know, foundational changes in how I viewed some of these things.
So and that view, I mean, it's under strong contention, I would say. I don't know everyone would agree with that, but I think Bitcoiners broadly do agree with that material incentives really matter. As I don't know if I said this online or offline, but the classic saying that the line between good and evil runs down the heart of every man. I would like to think I would be okay speaking on most Bitcoiners' behalf, that they would agree that material incentives are the thing that sway that line significantly. Not the only thing. There's still crimes of passion and all kinds of psychological stuff. But broadly, if you could snap your fingers and create hyperabundance, presumably people would chill out. Now, there's also arguments against that. You know, I think Dostoevsky said something like, you give people cakes and everything they want, nothing to do other than busy themselves with reproduction, and they would still create some chaos to like bring. So like all that notwithstanding, it seems like the best engineering thing we could do
Yeah.
And if it didn't work and people were going crazy in the hyperabundance, then I guess there would be a market solution for that somehow.
I think that because I agree. I think that of the things that we can control without controlling other people.
Yes.
Resource
Leaving
abundance.
human freedom intact. This is about the best. And it's funny because you're actually trying to optimize for human freedom to get that result.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then it's just like, okay, well, nobody's going to be happy just because when they say everything I want, people just don't know what they want. So people end up going after things that don't necessarily make them content. They go after things that, give them dopamine rush in the short term.
Yeah.
And if people were actually like pursue purpose in life and all these, Jordan Peterson's built a huge following around bringing this into the zeitgeist of our times, but, you can't get everybody to pursue purpose, and you can have people that are insane and and there's definitely the exceptions that are all happening on the margin for things. But yeah, I definitely agree that it could never be like completely perfect, but like viewed from a systemic level, it's an interesting thought experiment of like, okay, if we don't have to pursue resource accumulation anymore, then would it be possible for anybody to find purpose with anything?
I would believe that interstellar travel and exploration would be the next big thing we do, right?
Yeah.
And that seems like that would busy us for a while.
Totally.
If we got good at it. But yeah, I agree. I don't know. It's how malleable is human nature is an unanswered question.
Yeah.
You can't really know, right? I mean, we can read historically. We know that people have changed to some extent, but how rapidly is that possible? And I always go back to this too. The E.O. Wilson quote that the problem with the human condition is we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. So it's that tension that the culture and technology has evolved faster than our natural state, creates all this tension in us that maybe is the source of that.
It's literally evolutionary misfirings, right? Like we evolved at a certain state, and that's there because like when I was first going down the atheist rabbit hole and I was reading into Dawkins, and it was cool because he has like numerous examples throughout his books of different evolutionary misfirings that have happened because environments change rapidly in a certain way.
Exactly.
And the way that we evolved, we're not accustomed to it. And that we're probably going to be the number one species of evolutionary misfirings in the not too distant future. It's happening with us emotionally today.
Yes. This is why mammals survived dinosaurs, by the way, right? Like the sun went from the sky, but we had endothermic heat and we were
just wiped them out. And there's nothing they could do. And like a great example is like why, I love when Dawkins used the example of like how moths would, they naturally evolved to, they navigate by light from the top of their head. And they navigate by the sunlight and the moonlight as it's happening, and as it's rotating around the world. And that's how they evolved. So when you see moths like circling around lights, it's because it completely screws up their navigation mechanism on top of their head. And that's just like a great example of an evolutionary misfiring that occurred. Once electricity started producing natural light around the world and around cities, like they just didn't evolve for any of that. And that's definitely going to be happening with us in a variety of ways, probably at an increasing rate.
The light, I mean, century. I don't know if you've been down the quantum biology rabbit hole yet about light, blue light and all this stuff. Jack Cruz, he's been on the show recently talking a lot about it, but I don't know. It sounds like a thing. And there's, I don't know, there seem to be a lot of effects that people are experiencing both. We have like a red light sauna here, and that's given me a lot of positive benefits. The verdict's still out for me on the blue light, how bad it is. I try to get away from it, but who knows? One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably get it. You get that Bitcoin upends everything that state-sponsored schools teach us about money. For those who get the importance of Bitcoin, it is important that we have a smart way to buy and hold Bitcoin. My friends at Coinbits, the oldest Bitcoin-only exchange in the United States, have pioneered the concept of roundups, which converts your spare change into Bitcoin. Simply connect your credit or debit cards, and your usual purchases are rounded up to the nearest dollar, letting you stack sats on every purchase without even thinking about it. Coinbits also provides a terrific self-custody experience. Connect a hardware wallet for automatic withdrawals into cold storage to minimize your risk and stay sovereign over your Bitcoin. My favorite Coinbits feature is Coinbits Plus, which gives you the best exchange rate on Bitcoin. It even gives you real-time feedback on how well you are doing on your savings plan. With Coinbits Plus, power users can save more money to buy even more Bitcoin. All that, plus peer-to-peer cash and Bitcoin payments, target orders, price alerts, and more means Coinbits can help you do almost anything you need to do with Bitcoin. So go to coinbits.app/breedlove to sign up today. Again, that is Coinbits, BITS.app/breedlove. I wanted to ask you about the role of wisdom traditions in religion.
Okay.
Because we're talking about this, what is the thing here? The attempt to lower the transaction cost of trust, right? It's kind of like the through line. It's what money does. It's what religion does. It's what social norms do, culture perhaps even, right? When you start to know, you can expect how someone's going to move and operate, you can kind of take your attention off of them and focus on some other task, right? You gain trust basically. So what do you think? Obviously money is instrumental in this, but how, most of the people in the world now are shifting to become irreligious. And so there seems to be kind of this vacuum in a way and how we organize ourselves. What do you think? You're taking that kind of dog eat dog world, but there's also that other side of people where we have created these moral structures and we can act selflessly and all these wonderful things that people do. So like, how is that going to transform in the years ahead with all this technological revolution?
I think one of the most impactful things that I ever read was, are you familiar with David Foster Wallace's commencement address, This is Water?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And it was like, there was this girl I was dating a long time ago who was really bright, and she like introduced me to that. Yeah. And I was like, oh, it's going to be some like liberal bullshit.
That's really good.
Like, all right. And she like read it, and I was just like, and then he has this line in it where he's like, whether you worship the pagan gods or, Allah or, any sort of Judeo-Christian deity. What I do feel certain of is that if you worship anything that is not of this world, or if you worship something that is of this world, it's eventually just going to eat you alive. And the only reason everybody worships something, right? The question is what? Yeah. And that was the first time, because I was always like, oh, I'm like an atheist. I don't worship something. That was the first time I ever asked myself, like, well, what do I worship? Yeah. Still haven't really answered that question. I don't know, but it's something that I've like thought about for a long time.
How would you define worship in this context?
It's something, it's what, ultimately like what it is that's truly driving you, which I think is really hard for us to understand sometimes. It's hard for us to really see through like our true motivations of things. And it's one of those things where like, if somebody were to attack that aspect and say you are not that, like if you devote your life to believing in God, somebody says you don't believe in God, you'd probably get very defensive about that. And you say, I absolutely do. And it's just like, if you devote your life to worshiping, beauty or, something, and somebody says you're ugly, you're going to get very insecure about that. Right. So like maybe that's a good way of figuring these things out, is like, what are you insecure about? And,
many things.
So many things. Yeah. And there's like some things that really rise above all, where it's just like, if this were to leave your life, you would have a complete identity crisis, like that would be like God has left your life effectively.
My friend has talked about separating your identity from your accomplishments. Yep. I find that to be very difficult, right? Because as a man, especially, you want to be useful and valuable to others. And I'm like, if all that went away and I couldn't do that because of an injury, like how would I feel? And that's scary thought.
Right. And so much of that comes from like how you're raised and what was rewarded in you. And then at the end of the day, is that a bad thing?
Yeah.
You know? And
I'd like to answer love, but then even in love, it's like, I want to express that through acts of service, you know, taking care of the people that I care about. So it's like, if you're, I don't know, it's a tough question for me.
It's a really tough question. Yeah. Cause you can go back and forth on it different ways. And I think that like being able to make it something that's not materialistic or at least of this world and being able to separate it from that, it was almost like somewhat of an innovation in societies where, because what made us distinct in the evolutionary process is our ability to think outside of ourselves and create this other like third party perspective over how we think. So we could actually manipulate how we think over time. And that was, you know, like we had examples of us being able of other, you know, we were talking about this earlier with the birds that whatever the bird was building the house and like, you know, beavers building dams, and the animals were intelligent enough to manipulate their environments, but not really manipulate themselves. We were able to manipulate our environment very significantly. Then we developed this conscious machine that allowed us to say like, okay, well, we can understand our motivations in ourselves very in depth. And that makes us kind of go insane because it ultimately, through a certain level of, you know, intellectual and emotional maturity, we start to ask these big questions of existence and these existential questions that lead us towards a path of, you know, going back to the question of nihilism and like, you know, being an atheist of some form. How do you find purpose when you know that, you know, this ends and then that's it? If that's your belief, it's just like, well, why does this matter? And it's just like, I think that when I came to that conclusion, ironically, it ended up becoming one of the most motivating things to me. Like I was a very poor student in high school and I went off to college and I was a 4.0 GPA student. And it was kind of around when I got into all of this thinking. And I was just like, well, our purpose is to be here now. Like this is it. This is the whole show. And you can think about children as an extension of you, an extension of that happening, in which case that's probably number 2 is reproduce and do it as much as you can. But
be fruitful and multiply.
Right. From that perspective, it's like that all matters. But I think when you kind of like see the bottom, then humans found, I think that, well, we can't all think that way. And the majority of us have a very hard time. And, you know, I'm young, so like maybe this is going to screw me up at some point in life. You know, I don't know. But most people have a very hard time thinking in that way. There has to be a higher purpose outside of a finite life. And that ultimately aligns our incentives with society much better than the belief that this is finite and whatever happens after we're dead won't really impact us as much. Change the way people think fundamentally. It makes us think much more long-term. It makes us think into an afterlife. You
know, as you were describing that we, or the animal that developed this ability for taking on the perspective of another person. So this kind of multi-perspectival level of knowing is what probably gives us the empathy we were talking about much earlier, right? Like you would consider what it would be like to have something happen. And also game theory. It's the source of game theory, right? Where you're kind of looking at decision-making possibilities through the eyes of another player, deciding what they're going to do. And you're each trying to internalize one another one step ahead, right? And I just think that what is it about? There's something about the religious structure, getting everyone pointed at one thing and moving in one symbolic direction seemed to be like some kind of form of entrainment we needed to scale.
Totally.
If that makes sense. You know, like another one of these emergent things, because religion emerges everywhere. It's trends towards monotheism, broadly speaking. And so like getting everyone to move towards one symbolic structure was somehow instrumental in leading us into modernity, something like that.
I think that, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Like it allowed us to scale more because as we scaled, these conflicts of interest that naturally exist between an individual and society need to be alleviated by something. And we created like Dawkins refers it to like gap filling theory. We created theory that allows us to explain gaps in our knowledge. And we kind of filled these gaps of like morality of like, well, why should I act in accordance with a big society of a bunch of people I don't even know. We have sympathy with people that are most similar to us, which is actually a really funny thing in and of itself, because like there's so many people that have a ton of sympathies for like mammals and things that are very similar to how we are, but they hate insects.
Yeah. Right.
And it's just a natural phenomenon.
Yeah.
You know, they hate reptiles. They cut a snake's head off the first time they see it. They'd never do that to a puppy. What's the difference between the two?
Nietzsche said something about kill a butterfly and it's a tragedy, and kill a cockroach and you're a hero or something.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Because those, we've been evolutionary designed to know that those carry disease or they're predators.
Yeah.
They're not as similar to us. And they're competitive.
Yeah.
But yeah, we love things that are similar. And then the more dissimilar things become, we become more like antagonistic towards them. So like having a society scale requires us to, we had to have this belief system that was ingrained in us that there will be consequence to us not acting in accordance with society's will.
Right.
And like the story of, it's just like money, where the story of religions is emerged in a private, natural way to help us fill these gaps in our knowledge, give us a purpose, have us act in accordance with society. And governments take control of these things in organized systems, and they turn them into some of the greatest weapons that we've ever seen. And that was one of the reasons when I was, going on an atheistic bent, where I was against religion for the same reason Dawkins is against religion. If you look at some of the most horrible atrocities in the world, they've been created by systemic organizations of religion, because the tool they use is the concept of faith. If we can get you to believe in something blindly without rationalization, then the second we get you to believe in that, we can just start associating that belief with anything we want. And that's how you end up with suicide bombers. And that's how you end up with people doing all these crazy things for reasons that they don't even know anymore. And it's not, and it took me a while to really separate the idea of organized religion.
That's why communism is organized religion too.
Right.
Exactly what you're just describing. Right?
Exactly. You get people to associate with these ideas, and you got to get your foot in the door with this one belief, and you have to have really charismatic people, speak to you about what that little belief actually means. And then they manipulate that and get people to do terrible things. But I think once I learned to separate how organized religion is manipulated from the actual fundamental purpose of faith and living life. And I think that that's what's happening today. Like going back to the original point when you were bringing the question up of like, what's happening in the shift in society away from religion? It's like, well, religion is not going away. It's just changing. People are still worshiping things. Materialism is happening at a much more probably, who knows? But I would suspect with social media that there's a lot of people at least plagued by worshiping that.
That's true. That's very true.
And like that's one of the big shifts. But like when people are switching, I think religion's becoming a bit more individualized. That's one of the big shifts is like, wellness, spirituality. It's religion. You're just worshiping certain aspects of like health. And I think it's generally a good thing. It's reducing the communal aspects, which does make it harder. And I think that, maybe it's a mean reversion thing. But I think we'll probably have a reversion. People want to find communities of people that they have similar values with, and they can all sit around and talk about
the internet lowers the transaction cost to that discovery process. So maybe that's an offset. But it does fragment, right? But then people can discover each other more easily. So
exactly.
That's really interesting. And money's often described as a belief system. That's one of the answers to what is money. And so then very quickly, like, oh, well, what's the difference between money and a religion? And so there's some overlap there. And it's fascinating to think, because we already know that changes in the technological landscape change our language, right? Through like metaphors and phrases, now we say, oh, that's a feature, not a bug. And that can be applied to a bunch of different scenarios, someone's personality or whatever else. But 25 years ago, it didn't make any sense because we didn't have that technology. But then how much does changing in the technological landscape also change this religious impulse that humans need to assign to something, it seems like. It's like built into our machinery. I guess as being symbolic animals, right? There's just kind of like the highest value in the hierarchy of valuation, basically, becomes God in that sense. Not to limit God to just that, but like that's one aspect of it.
I think, and I'm curious about this because it's something I've always wondered about, but I've always presumed that because we like to take everything and we'd like to turn it into narrative, because that's how we evolve to understand things over time, is to take it and form it into narrative. I mean, it's not just with like, telling people stories. It really happens in everything, in the professional world and academia. If you have to really the ability to persuade people, it means you need to be an exceptional storyteller. You need to be able to turn things into narrative in a way that people can understand.
And back it with mathematical rigor, which is kind of what the Keynesians are doing. Like they use that mathematical illusion, but
exactly. Yeah. It's like, these are the facts. Like it's really complicated. Don't worry about them, but
misapplied to the wrong knowledge framework. But
so like when we're telling these narratives to ourselves, like I think that people just have always naturally moved towards, we need to take these values and we need to create, stories to understand them. And then our way of doing that is to personify these things in some sort of way. We have to personify these narratives to have stories around them. And it's just the framework with which most people need to understand things. So we've always, I think, naturally gravitated towards that. And it's like nowadays we're trying to remove ourselves a bit from that, maybe because we're smarter or we're more, well-adjusted individuals. I don't know, but I'm assuming that we'll revert to it in some of these practices that are happening today too.
Yeah. What do you think of role? Sorry to keep going down this path. I have one more question. Because there's this book I read, Inventing the Individual, and it was making the case that before Christ, actually, there was no such thing as individual private property, innocent until proven guilty. The individual as the primary social unit basically happened after Christ. And now the individual it also emerged in other places in the world. So it's not to make this exclusively Western, but this is just focusing on the Western story. So there do seem to be pragmatic discoveries through religious structures, right? They're not just adult fairy tales. Right. That we do figure out pragmatic ways of being that they start out as kind of like a moral intuition, but then they get codified as law over time. Yep. And that does change the trajectory of society. Like I think it could be argued assuming his argument is correct, and it's a long, lengthy book, I won't reformulate the thing here, but that Christ was instrumental in inventing the individual and private property rights. Yep. Then things like, the success of Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, like these things actually have, some lineage in that, right? That private property rights and wide risk sharing, all these things led to the technological developments that made these companies super large and valuable. Right. So do you buy into the pragmatic technological aspect of religion, I guess, as discovering these social principles or legal principles?
I guess,
sorry, to put a button on it, Dawkins said he considers himself culturally a Christian. Would be kind of like the summation of that.
It's funny because I caught myself saying that sometimes with people. Because I grew up in a lot of, I was raised Catholic, grew up in Christian communities. And there's a wealth of things I think valuable about it, other than I don't believe the fundamental tenets. But the value systems, it's like associated away from the actual story of, really what it is that every religious story, it's a set of values, right? And you need to have an association with an opinion on creationism, the philosophical nature of where we came from. It's it's almost like you could still even be Christian in terms of values. Like they won't say you can do this. Maybe there's a sect where you can, but you could even be Christian in terms of values and to say, I'm agnostic to where we came from. But I believe that there's some sort of higher power or something that exists and we don't understand it yet, but we're communicating with it in some sort of way. And these are all good practices and values to live my life by. And I think that's a version that a lot of people are starting to believe nowadays too. And a lot of people are like, okay, well, maybe we got ahead of our skis and saying, it was however many millions of years ago that the world began and stuff like that, But I think that, sorry, the original question was,
just like the discovery of practical, again, there's I call it moral software update. It's like my rough metaphor for it. So like if Christ does emerge and then you figure out, individual property rights are actually better than the idea of the patriarchy and the father owns everything. Right. Because prior to that, the father owned the family basically, it's like tribes. And then we start to legally codify the recognition of each individual can run their own P&L and balance sheet and be a business and do all these things in the world that they previously couldn't. That actually unlocks a lot of economic productivity and whatnot.
I mean, I think it's fundamentally progressive in nature, right? I think it's fundamentally that there is a value system that is in flux at any point in time. And there's a natural consensus we achieve in society around like what there's certain values that are the most objective to us that are we've achieved a broad consensus on, like don't murder people in cold blood for no reason. You know, like there's certain things that everybody agrees on. And then there's these marginal areas that there's a bunch of disagreement and debate. But I think that, you know, it's constantly in flux. And when our value system is shifting over time, it's like we as it evolves for the circumstances that we're under, that's the other thing too, right? Like if you go read the Old Testament in the Bible, like there is some dark shit in the Old Testament. And it's because it was a set of values that was very relevant during the Bronze Age. And that's like, these things are all changing in a way that are relevant to our times. And those set of values at that point in time were not relevant to how we live society today. It would actually really hinder the way that we organize and socialize with one another. So, you know, I think that it's almost like as our value systems shift and as our environment shifts, we have spontaneous realizations that really emerge from that constant shifting. And I feel like that's kind of what you're describing with this.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And do you think that those spontaneous realizations exclusively emerge from, let's say, capital accumulation or the technological paradigm? Is it purely bottom up, or is there some, I don't know, top down agential human thing where we can, it's clearly a feedback loop, but you know.
So the top down stuff, I feel like it comes from this, right? Like
dialogue.
Dialogue. Yeah. When there's, and what is this, right? Like you're the beneficiary of this very large movement towards independent journalism that's come about in society, and it's only growing.
And
more.
Independent money,
and nobody knows where this is heading, right? Like Spotify made this whole pivot into audio content for books and for everything because like engagement's so high and the ability to monetize. It's a whole new way that people are learning, and nobody even knows where this market's going to settle. You know, are the largest media organizations of the world just going to be podcasts going forward of individuals? And then how are they going to be corrupted? What's going to happen to Joe Rogan in 10 years? You know, there's all of these, technology is enabling somewhat of a top down way for, I think like the current zeitgeist to exist versus like the institutionalization of it and how that's been manipulated by centralized forces. And the effects that that's having, like of over wokeism and how like at the flip of a switch, everything changed all of a sudden when, for the first time, it was like quantifiable that they are not the most popular belief in the US. And I think that that's wild and that's hard but a lot of people are realizing that no, it's just like most people are pretty down to earth and don't really care. And most people aren't idiots who drive around in trucks and throw beer cans out and vote for Trump. Like, you know, that's not how the world works. I go outside, but it's, and I think that there's this huge shift where a lot of people are like, you know, I can breathe now and not have to worry about being on my toes. And there's not as much pressure to do and say things as before. And it comes from this exactly right here.
There's more pressure release through peer-to-peer dialogue, maybe. So it doesn't. And also people focusing less attention on mainstream media, which seem to be purposefully aggravating it. You know?
Totally. Yep.
That attentional shift also contributes to people just being like, oh yeah, it's okay. I go outside every day and interact with multiple strangers and 99% of them are fine. You know, so I've probably kept you almost long enough now, but just to try to tie this back into things we were talking about earlier, you know, decline in religious participation, but there's still this religious impulse people have that maybe even religion served as a form of entrainment to get people to kind of go one symbolic direction at a time. You know, what is the role of something like Bitcoin emerging? Like this it's a global money, but it's also a social institution. It's also very disruptive to the state. So it's going to at least transform, if not annihilate, some of the existing power structures in the world. Annihilate might be too strong a word, starve perhaps. How I don't know. Is money religious? Is Bitcoin religious? Are we in a cult? You know, play with these ideas.
Oh, we're totally in a cult. Yeah. And it's definitely the best cult in the world, man. Like,
cult with the best money for sure.
It gets you rich. Yeah. Like, join it. I don't know why you wouldn't. But yeah, of course, like, I think when I was coming from like traditional finance and getting involved in this world, and I got like deeper and deeper into like the culty aspects of what's happening in Bitcoin, at first I was like, well, okay, this is weird. Like, gonna stay away from this. And the more I get involved in it, I'm like, oh no, this is what makes it cool. Yeah. Like, there's a bunch of crazy people who are diehard about this thing. And like, it doesn't even matter if I agree with you about everything. Yeah. What matters is like, we had enough, like that type of person. Yeah. Is really what it took to bootstrap this thing into significance. It got
a lot of disagreeable people to agree.
Exactly. Basically. It got a bunch of disagreeable, crazy people, incredibly opinionated, thinking 100 years into the future and saying that after it'd been around for a couple of years. Yeah. And that was really necessary to bootstrap the whole thing. Now it's like, okay, well, if we're trying to get, as we have, nation states and governments and large financial institutions adopt this, maybe like Max Kaiser isn't like the number one guy who should be like promoting these things, but like it's, and then, you need suit and tie type guys. It's like, I like the crazy people. I enjoy being around that more anyways, but I understand the role for everybody within the ecosystem. Yeah. And like, and I think it's just evolving and there's some of that. But with Bitcoin, I think that Bitcoin is, it's symbolic, right? Yeah. And I don't want to go full Jordan Peterson and get, drunk on the symbology of it, but I definitely think that what we're witnessing, and my belief and like why I started my firm, is I think we're witnessing the greatest technological revolution of our lifetimes when we find a way to create a perfectly neutral monetary system. And that changes everything. And to your point, it changes how society is structured. And I think the most interesting thing is like, if we were to like go pre-Bitcoin, how would we actually want to have reduced state power? It's like, if you're a libertarian, you're like, I want to reduce the power of the state. And it's just like, okay, well, let's say hypothetically you're given a wand that could reduce the power of the state within your country, then what happens if you did that? What if we reduced it to the level that we wanted in the US? Now we're at risk compared to other government institutions that are much more scaled with stronger militaries and all these benefits that are afforded to them because of it. Yeah. Now we're all at risk. And it's like, I don't want that either. The only thing I want is for the state simultaneously at a global level to have its power reduced. Like, that's the only way that it makes sense, at least for everybody. In manipulating currency globally in a very rapid way is the only way to do that. Yeah. And like, that's the really interesting part about it, is that like, it actually creates this like, out of all the ways, it's not going to be easy. There's going to be a ton of growing pains associated with it, but out of all the ways it could happen, like that, this is kind of the way that it would have to happen in hindsight. Right. It appears that way. And I think that a neutral system it's going to change the way we structure society. And then we look back on it and it's like the Bitcoin logo is just going to be symbolic of, a new movement towards, technological utopia and technological freedom and this new era that I think we're kind of entering into society just when things seemed like they were getting bad enough. Right. That's kind of when it emerged.
Yeah, it's a great optimistic view. Do you think it gets boring? I thought about this too. Like, does Bitcoin get boring at some point? I don't know, 3 to 5
I feel like we're going to be in
our
like adolescent years right now, where it's going to be boring, institutionalized. Like, the people that want to support it in certain ways have to start playing political games or financial games and things like that. Not everybody has to do that. That's not really what I'm trying to say, but I think there's going to be boring aspects of it. Yeah. I don't know. I think we got a long ride ahead of us, though. I think it's going to get crazy again at some point. Yeah. I feel like we're going to grind up into the millions, and then the question becomes, are we going to go beyond digital gold 2.0 and into freedom money? Yeah. And then that's when we hit another S curve.
Interesting. Where would you draw the line between those two distinctions?
So like, we have this whole institutionalizational process, and so much of this goes back to how the banking system around it starts to emerge and how it gets adopted. And like, I don't view it as likely. I think the incentives are aligned for a neutral system to emerge. But I think that there's a very strong probability that, Bitcoin could turn into just like a scarce digital asset that people are using, and it, people control it in a really significant manner. Maybe it's not completely controlled, but most people have kind of, capitulated around just like getting exposure to it through financial mechanisms. So like if that would be an example of the world where digital gold 2.0 exists, and that would be not freedom enabling. And people make, a lot of people are going to make some money off of it. And that's a pretty big market size, and maybe it expands a bit beyond gold. Maybe it expands into other store value, and like we really consume a lot of other store value assets. But if the peer-to-peer nature of it starts to work and we get, enough infrastructure built around it and enough, strong enough credit markets that are pretty sophisticated and legitimate institutions, that are operating on a purely Bitcoin standard. I ultimately think though, how this is going to happen is more at the nation state level is really how it proliferates. Ironically, I like my view, like a decade from now is where I think that a significant amount of foreign exchange is going to start being settled in it just because it's neutral. Yeah. It's going to start to make a lot more sense for some people to do that. Yeah. And we're going to have like a consortium of global South economies that have established pretty significant reserves in it. And, they have direct trade relationships using the asset. I was just on Natalie Brunel's and, I think that like in terms of a proportion of foreign exchange, I was making this point that like, Chinese yuan's not that significant in terms of, global dominance. And I think Bitcoin could surpass it pretty easily in 10 years. And I think like that'll be a big moment.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think it happens at a nation state level where it really starts to get used outside of just like for what they would use gold for.
Right. That's interesting. I mean, yeah, it seems definitely going that direction. And then the question is how much will they be shrinking at the same time? It comes down to their revenue mix in terms of how much money printing,
right?
Because that will sort of be getting eclipsed as a revenue option.
Totally. That's a good point. Like the first country, because there's going to be countries that do it because they basically have no other incentive to like not hyperinflate their currencies because they're trash already. But like countries that don't like have a strong disincentive to not hyperinflate their currency, the first one that does that to accumulate a bunch of Bitcoin, like that's the canary in the coal mine of like the suddenly moment. Yeah.
Well, that might be us. Might be the United States.
I know.
I don't want to say us. The United States. Let's be specific. We are Americans, but I don't like to speak in collective terms. We're all individuals. All right, dude. This has been an awesome conversation.
Yeah, this was great.
Yeah, thank you for the wealth of knowledge, unique perspectives, a lot of excellent points. So great work. Where can people find out more about you or your work on the internet?
Just follow me on X. It's just my name, Eric Yakes, and you can check out my company's website. That's epochvc.io.
Awesome. Thanks so much, man.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.